Chairman of Inveniam.
Thank you. Well, first off, it's great to be with all of you. Inveniam lives at that intersection of AI, crypto, and private markets. And we hear a lot about markets moving digital, which is incredibly important. But as we think about those markets moving digital, people focus on the digital ledger, they focus on compute, and Inveniam is that decentralized data architecture, which we believe is the most important component of private market assets going on chain. And that is any function that centralizes on the ledger or centralizes on the compute or centralizes on the data is going to create a bottleneck that is an impediment to the free-flowing markets that should exist globally. And so in Inveniam, we live at this intersection where we're trying to promote a decentralized data architecture where individuals, corporations, and nations own their own data, they index their own data, they vector embed their data, and then they semantically chunk their own data so that they control it and they allow forms of automation to interact with that data. What does that mean? Whether a smart contract needs to go and get data, whether an AI agent needs to go and get data, or you're using robotic process automation to go and get that data, you need a mechanism as you go and get that data to make sure you're getting the right data. And people don't want to just push all, particularly in private markets, they don't want to push all their data in one giant centralized database. And by the way, if the roughly $600 trillion of private market assets that don't touch the current markets, capital markets world that we live in today are going to come on chain, we're not going to get them there by saying, hey, give us all your data. There's data retention obligations, there's market operators who don't want to share their data, and creating an Edgar database for private market assets is not the right solution. What is the right solution? We would say Tim Berners-Lee in Semantic Web, when he wrote that article, he wrote 3 versions, 99, 2001, 2003. When he wrote those, he talked about a future of the world that we think we're bringing about today, which is where you own your own data, you control your own data, and then you allow agents to interact with that data and then deliver it to other end users or agents. And if they're doing it, they need to be able to prove origin of that data, process of that data, and state of that data. Why does that matter? Because if you're looking at trading an asset that you don't have a mark for, right? If real world assets are trading and we're talking about a treasury, there's a ton of marks for a treasury, there's no price discovery in treasuries. You know what I mean? There's an active market trading all the time, it's an efficient market. Same thing with Apple or Nvidia shares and now SpaceX. But if you're talking about a piece of the capital stack of an asset, you need to be real-time surveilling that asset and understanding the condition of that asset in real time. And this is what Inveniam does. We give you the ability to surveil the data systems of a real asset like the building that we're in, or private equity, infrastructure, private credit, and real estate. Those are the 4 areas we live in. These are data-rich, low-frequency trading assets. And we are the mechanism by which you can surveil that asset and you can start to understand the condition of that asset on any given day. And we do that by looking at data that's not structured. Why? Structured databases, people who work with structured data, there's a ton of winners in that data, and all of those guys' valuations begin with a T, right? The people who are in that space. Then there's semi-structured data, right? And let's call that JSONs and information that exists, and Snowflake, Databricks, they own that. But the unstructured document-level data that you need to rely upon to trade real estate, private credit, understand the collateral of private credit, to understand private equity or infrastructure assets, lives in documents and it lives at the edge. This is what Inveniam does. We are focused on unstructured document-based data where you can surveil it and look every night at midnight and say, is there any change of state in that data? And if there is a change in that state of data, we give you a mechanism to index the new version, meaning name it, vector embed it so it's searchable by AI on an automated basis, semantically chunk it so you understand by context and relationship what it's related to, all within your own, as an asset owner, security envelope, and then you allow others in to see it. And we're anchoring all of this on chain as a form of a timestamp, and we anchor it on chain in multiple chains as a mechanism to have not only redundancy, but also wallet-based access control. And in addition, it makes it quantum resistant. How does it make it quantum resistant? Because we're using multiple consensus mechanisms, not just cryptography, to prevent a hack against a single asset. So what we're doing is we're creating a mechanism for an asset owner. Most of our clients are very large banks, very large sovereign wealth funds that have the ability to index, that want to, not have the ability, that want to understand the data operations about the most valuable data in the world. And Inveniam is how you get that data machine readable. How do we do that? A, we're giving you surveillance to manage data operations. We manage surveillance, we look for new data, again, index, vector, embed, semantically chunk, and then you make it available for third parties to gain access to it. This is the mechanism for AI to work at scale against the largest assets in the world that are data rich and low frequency trading. And how are we making that happen? Because the lingua franca of private markets are appraisals, they are credit agreements, they are lease amendments, they are side letters, and what we're doing is giving the ability for you to understand this. We've been in this for about 10 years, getting the decentralized data architecture ready to move to the market. And we talk about structured, unstructured, and in Inveniam, we live in this area where you want to own your own data, you don't want to leak your data, you want to use AI for that data, and you need us to be that on-ramp for AI without leaking your data. We got a couple different sovereign wealth funds that have become investors in Inveniam over the last 10 years. And when we first began, we were saying, we had a core thesis that decentralized data, if we're going to trade private market assets digitally, you can't have the world's largest database in the middle. You need to have this mechanism to surveil it. So we came up with this decentralized data architecture. And lo and behold, that's the right architecture that AI wants as well. Because you are surveilling data at the edge where that data sits natively, where it sits at rest, and in the context in which it was created. Why does that matter? AI doesn't work without context. It needs to know, where did it come from? Is this the right document? Proof of origin. Proof of state, is it the most recent version? And proof of process, who improved that data along the way? And what this does is it gives us the ability to monitor the data for an asset like this. So in the last 10 years, we've onboarded about $200 billion of assets that we're monitoring on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, where we literally can monitor the data in the systems, let's call it in a building like this, the roughly 12 systems that maintain what you need to know so you can trade this asset on any given day. What we're doing is not creating a data room where we're centralizing all the data. We're giving you the ability to agentically surveil the data about this building, where that data lives at rest, and look and see if there's any change of state of data. What does that mean? That means you can make sure that this building is ready for sale 24/7, 365. And if you're surveilling it, you've got an up-to-date data room that is a federated data room, that you're looking at it and it's indexed, you can name it, vector embedded, it's searchable by AI, and it's semantically chunked. All of a sudden you have the ability to understand your data that lives in many dozens or hundreds of silos and interact with forms of automation. But we can't just interact with forms of automation willy-nilly. What we do is we put on top of that a form of governance where the form of automation inherits the rights of the user of the system. So if you have the ability to look at a portfolio inside a bank and you can't see other data that's in a different part of the bank, and you're using AI, that AI can only see the data that you're allowed to see. And what you're doing is you're querying it, and that agent is proving origin, process, and state of data for the answer that it gave back to you. And what this does is it not only gives you the ability to prove and come up with the same answer every time you use that AI, but also when somebody else is going to rely on that data, you can prove to them where you got the data. Does that make sense? So all of a sudden we can start to price these assets. I want to give you an example. We have, working with one of the sovereign wealth funds, we have about let's call it about $1.8 billion US portfolio of real estate that they wanted to sell. We had been monitoring that. That was one of the early large portfolios that we put on our platform. We were surveilling that. And what we did is we were able to pull that data, feed it real time into a valuation engine, and JLL was marking that asset on a monthly basis. So they were marking the gross asset value, then they can run the waterfall, the carry calculation, the expense allocation. That means you can price the capital stack on an automated basis. Does that make sense? So JLL was pricing on a monthly basis this $1.8 billion portfolio of real estate that one of our clients had. They went to sell that to another third party, another sovereign wealth fund backed entity. And when they did that, they called us, we refreshed all the data, pushed it into a JLL, what's called Argus upload. They had all of the monthly data for the last 5 years. They were able to set a price, and the buyer was able to do due diligence on a $1.8 billion real estate transaction in 11 days. That's normally a 6 to 9 month function that they squeeze down to 11 days. What we're doing is we're taking the longest pole in the tent, the ability for you to due diligence an asset, and we're making it nearly instantaneous, right? That was the first time that transaction sold for $1, actually 1 dirham more than JLL set the mark on that. What we're doing is giving you the ability to monitor real-time assets and bring them on chain with the ability to not only do that in a manner in which you're not leaking the data, but you're also not manually maintaining a data room every month, every quarter that's constantly getting stale. You have data where on an automated basis it's looking into the systems that manage the very operations of the business. Now I have this fabulous PowerPoint that I'm supposed to be talking about or using, but I'm going to skip it for right now. But what you're doing is we're giving you this ability to harness all these forms of automation. We originally built this where the form of automation was going to be the smart contract, right? Because every time you try and automate something, you hope for efficiency, but the only thing you're guaranteed eventually is a lawsuit, right? You did this on an automatic basis. How do I know where you got this number from? And what we're doing is giving you that auditability that you can show that this smart contract that got this data from here and it processed a trade and delivered it over here, that you have a mechanism to audit every piece of that every step of the way. Then about 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, Inveniam, we started to see really the rise of AI was going to be definitively in relationship with smart contracts. So we stood up an AI business. We have a guy who's our global head of AI. He lives in Abu Dhabi now. We think he's the world's leader of the interaction between AI and blockchain. And as we did this, we began to realize that not only do we need to understand how an agent got that data where it delivered it to, but we had to do it in a manner where we needed to understand that another agent was going to rely on it, and it was going to have to prove where that data came from. And the answer is not putting that data on chain. It's just putting the proof of origin, process, and state of data using zero-knowledge proofs on chain. And what that does is it gives you a blockchain solution to commute truth from one function, an agent, to another function, another agent, on behalf of two ultimate beneficial owners, if that makes sense. And what Inveniam wants to do is we want to create this data architecture where we have Inveniam IO, our data operations solution, Dokugami, we're going to be launching next month, document graph machine, or markup language, excuse me. We're doing this in conjunction with the fellow, John Powley, who's one of the main creator, one of the 3 creators, who's the largest committer for XML. And this is, we think, going to be the native language as agents encounter any document-based data, a lease, an appraisal, a credit agreement, and it's going to say, what is this thing? And we want to be the native language where agents can understand data that's not structured or semi-structured, which is the basis of all private market data. And then lastly, Inveniam Chain, which we launched 12 months ago, which is the first chain native to agents. So this is what we're doing, and we're driving stronger verifiable data to support agentic activity at scale. And this is the basis for how these massive portfolios of illiquid assets are going to become more liquid in a tokenized state. And Inveniam, we've been focused for 10 years on real world assets, and by that we mean private market assets being valued more frequently having the ability to discover pricing and the state of entropy of that asset in real time, so you can run that waterfall, you can run that carry calculation, expense allocation, price to capital stack. This has massive functionality for how interval funds are traded, how real estate's traded, and we think this is going to change store of value, where you're going to be able to go to a multifamily housing portfolio and literally buy a latte with your multifamily housing portfolio, that Visa is going to power that, and we're going to go in and because we're pricing that multifamily housing portfolio on a daily basis, you can get in and out, and literally banks are going to play a very limited role, and it's not going to even resolve to your underlying bank account. It's going to resolve to a stable coin and a tokenized portfolio of multifamily housing that's spread broadly across multiple MSAs that we can get real-time visibility into. And Inveniam chain, what we want to do is be that interface between the data on a daily basis that serves as the collateral, it serves as the risk analogs to other assets, and give the ability for the entire DeFi market to engage with the $600 trillion of assets that are currently outside the capital market system. And what we want to do is start by moving $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $50 trillion, $100 trillion into this. And as we're doing this, where we can correlate assets at a scale that hasn't been done before, and what I mean by that is, this is what Michael Milken did, right? He went to high yield bonds and he correlated them one to the other. And every one of those bonds had different covenants and different collateral, but he created a mechanism that the market bought off on, so they could understand that if a bond traded, other bonds that have a correlation or to that could be repriced. Lou Ranieri did this with mortgages. We now live in an agentic world where we can surveil assets at the edge and the data, and with the indexing, vector embedding, and semantic chunking, we can correlate assets and do large data set pattern recognition at a scale that's never been done before. One of our investors is a company called G42. G42 is the largest investor in AI in the world. They led that last round in Anthropic, and they are the largest processor of data in the world. So every time you use ChatGPT, you're doing it, that inference is happening on one of their machines. And what we're doing is getting the data ready for these illiquid assets for large data set pattern recognition to correlate assets to one another, so we can understand, as a single asset trades in one place, what that does is it informs other like assets that are trading. And it's really easy to do this over homogeneous assets, things that are very similar. But when you do things over a heterogeneous asset class, like commercial real estate, you need very large data sets. And the good news is that's what we're building, and creating a relationship where you can surveil assets real time, you can price them, you can understand risk analytics, you can create indices, so you can create perps, so you can short them. Earlier this week, we had our new real world asset perps platform approved by both Google, so it's in the Play Store and it's in the Apple Store, and then we're now bringing that back to the regulator, where we'll have the first regulated perps market, where on one side you can be trading a security, and on the other side you can be trading a commodity future. Right now, there's no place in the world that those two things can coexist. So you're going to be able to trade a perp of Bitcoin or USDC versus a portfolio of multifamily housing. You're going to be able to go long. You're going to be able to do that against a perp for an interval fund that is only taking daily subscriptions and weekly redemptions, netting those things out back and forth one against the other. But you're going to be able to have this derivative against them, so you're going to have a futures market where you can trade and you can short that asset. So if you don't like private credit, you don't believe private credit has the underlying collateral that's performing, how do you trade that against US Treasuries? This is what Inveniam's doing. And what we're doing is getting the data ready for AI. And this is what we produce in Inveniam.io: source linked graph, data graphs, smart provenance, lifecycle automation, and edge AI consumption. This is what Inveniam is. We're super excited to be here with all of you. We'd like to help you as you want to engage with AI, with your tools. We think you're the mechanism or the on-ramp for that. We're super excited to be here with Redstone, who we think are superstars on data, and what we are is their partner. So if there's on-chain data that's public, that's referencing prices, use them. If it's complex data where you have to reference data that lives in a document that you want to be surveilling daily and making sure it's still enforced, whether it's an ISDA, a compliance certificate, a collateral, an appraisal of collateral, we can literally be monitoring that on a daily basis, looking for change of state. This is what Inveniam does. We're super excited to be here, and we'd love to partner with any of you that want to really begin having agentic surveillance of real-world assets. Thank you, guys.